On this episode of Doing the Most, we're brewing up a viewer's choice. That's right, you voted for the ingredients, style, and yeast of this brew.
Homemade brews and various R2s, everything from mead to roast. Bake creation, fermentation, inebriation, doing the most.
To get to the origin of this interesting fermented product, we have to go to the Doin' the Most community page. We have a lot of folks who follow the community page on YouTube, and about a month ago we put up some polls for ingredients and yeast and other elements of a brew we wanted to make with the community. And y'all voted for this. First up, we wanted to determine the fermentable sugar, and out of all the options, y'all chose brown sugar as our fermentable sugar. And then y'all voted on fruit. And initially, for the first few days, dates were clearly in the lead. But shortly after, bananas pulled ahead with a slight lead. So, we're going to brew with both. But since dates were the first front runner, we're going to primarily use dates for the fermentable fruit in this brew. For the liquid we were brewing in, we gave you several options, and overwhelmingly the community voted for tea. So we went with cold brew black tea. Then on to style. It was a closer poll, but overwhelmingly, big beer style between 8 and 10% ABV came out ahead. And then of course, we needed to figure out what flavoring or bittering was going to be done, since this was going to be in the style of a big beer. And with the options, y'all chose Gruit. Gruit is a historical bittering and flavoring herbal technique, and so we got to have a little bit of fun deciding what we wanted to throw in there. More on that in a bit. Lastly, we needed to pick a yeast, and potentially due to the fact that I talk about it a lot, Kveik came out well ahead. So we brewed this with Kveik Hornindal, and as you'll see, we decided to crank up the temperature a little bit. The ingredients for this sparkling date wine are 4 pounds of brown sugar, 6.6 pounds of dried pitted dates, 1 pound of bananas, and tea to 5 gallons. The Gruit contained 35 grams of mugwort, 40 grams of elderflowers, 30 grams of sumac, 2 star anise, and 30 grams of juniper. So with all of our ingredients in hand, it was time to get on to our brew day. I started by making a little bit of headspace in these gallons of spring water and adding 4 tea bags to each jug. By the math on the box, this was enough to create tea out of each of these jugs of water. I let those stand by the directions for 5 minutes, and it brewed up a nice light tea that I could see making a pretty good sweet iced tea. Just saying as, a country boy from the South. For the bananas, we went down to the Asian market here in town and picked up some Thai bananas. This is a pound of bananas, and I threw them into the freezer as soon as I got them home and then thawed them. And yes, I am throwing those in with the peels on. Banana peels can actually contribute a nice bit of body to a country fruit wine. And since that's kind of technically what this is, I felt like, sure, why not? Throw them in with the peels on. Maybe they'll contribute a little extra flavor as well. Then I chopped up about 5.5 pounds of the dates. The other pound went back into the freezer for reserve. Then it was time to get our Gruit together. I chose mugwort because from my reading it looked like that used to be pretty popular in Gruit. And then of course elderflowers are also a great herbal addition for beer style products. I threw in a couple of star anise because I wanted a little bit of a pop of interest in there. And then I had this bag of ground sumac, so we decided to play around with that as well. Sumac's got kind of a lemony flavor. I put the sumac into a tea ball, and looking back on it, I should have just put it all into primary, but I wanted to see what would happen boiling and steeping the sumac. So I clipped that onto the side, and then I filled a brew bag with the other ingredients. And then I poured in the dregs from the black tea that I squeezed out of the tea bags and 1 of the gallons of tea. Brought that up to a rolling boil and took it off the heat to let it steep for 30 minutes. After 30 minutes, I pulled everything out and I held on to the brew bag because I was wondering if I might need a little bit more of that Gruit flavor in this brew. So I put it to the side for a bit. then the fermentable sugars need to go in. So I used 2 pounds of light brown sugar and 2 pounds of dark brown sugar. I have no idea if that had any effect on the flavor, but that's what was available at the store. And then poured in another gallon of my tea. Made sure to stir that around real well so the brown sugar dissolved and the dates were kind of moving around in the bottom of the brew kettle. And then I boiled that for 30 minutes. I tasted the Gruit and it wasn't strong enough, so I went ahead and threw the brew bag in to my primary bucket, as well as my juniper berries. Then the Gruit went in and the date banana slurry on top of that. Once that was complete, I added the rest of my tea. And like I said, the sumac didn't really come through, so I went ahead and added more for that grand total of 30 grams. And stir, stir, stir. This was looking and smelling pretty interesting, definitely very sugary. And my hope was that in boiling those dates that I was saturating the must with sugar from the dates, because dates are just little sugar bombs. And I really wanted to extract as many of those sugars out into the must as I could, because I felt like that would help fermentation speed along rather than the yeast having to try and kind of needle their way into the dates and extract those sugars on their own. In my opinion, it worked pretty well. So I popped a lid on there and let it cool a little bit. And then I pitched in a few teaspoons of yeast nutrient just by package instruction. And this is diammonium phosphate, not my usual, but because when running this through the beer calculator to try and kind of figure out where the gravity was going to be, it looked like it was just a shade over 10% alcohol. I figured that DAP would be fine in this. And then, like I said, we used Hornindal Kveik yeast. Now you're gonna notice I'm not taking a gravity reading. As mentioned, I ran this through a beer calculator to try and figure out approximately where that gravity was going to clock in at, but I knew a lot of the fermentable sugars were locked up in the dates, locked up in the bananas. So taking a gravity was not going to give a solid impression of where this thing was going to land, because a lot of the sugars just weren't available for the hydrometer to test. But fortunately, there's some great folks out there who have built some great brewing calculators, and you can punch in your ingredients and it'll give you a close approximation to where you hit on your gravity. And then you know if it ferments all the way out and your hydrometer drops to 1, you have probably hit in or around the area of the predicted ABV. And you'll notice here that I'm using an actual bubbler airlock, pretty atypical. If you follow the channel, typically you'll see me throw an upturned coffee mug on there with a paper towel. But this was going outside, and it was going to live outside for a few days because I wanted to get that temperature up under the Oklahoma sun. So I figured a bubbler was the safest way to keep bugs out. That next day, I went and took a peek inside, and it was a hot day. It was in the 90s outside that day. But with the solar heat and the activity of the yeast, this thing was clocking in at over 104 degrees Fahrenheit fermenting outside. I sent a text to a friend who was very curious how the yeast hadn't died under that temperature stress. Kveik is one of my favorite discoveries I've made over the last few years. Definitely check out Kveik yeast. After about a week, it had fermented all the way out. And before I did anything else with it, I wanted to throw that other pound of dates in there. Now, this was recommended by a viewer who figured we would probably get better date flavor with some dates in secondary. So I took the recommendation and gave it a shot. I also pulled the Gruit bag at this point, figuring it's probably spent. 3 days later, everything looked pretty well fermented. The dates that had been added after primary had definitely looked like they had given up all they had, so I decided to get this racked off and clarified. As you can see, there was a little bit of loss. That much of the bucket was actually still full of fruit pulp that went right into the compost bin. Anna's sister wanted to help with a couple of brew chores, so she measured out my sparkaloid. That's 1 tablespoon of sparkaloid into a cup of boiling hot water, and that just goes right in to clarify. Now, I didn't get footage of this, but it was having a tough time clearing, so I also added in about a tablespoon of pectic enzyme because it became apparent that there was some pectin haze locked in there, and that helped it drop super clear. This being the big beer that it was, I decided to keg this instead of try and bottle condition it. But there was still a little bit of fluff in there, and so I read online that you can add some gelatin to it on kegging. So I decided to give that a shot. The instructions were to bloom the gelatin for 20 to 30 minutes and then put it in the microwave for 1 minute and then put it in the bottom of the keg. And then you pour off the first pint from the keg. It should be kind of thick and goopy, and that's the stuff that dregs from the bottom of your keg, and the rest should be clear beer. So the gelatin goes in the keg, our date wine goes in the keg, and we get that all nice and carbonated. I took a little bit of a taste here, and it was just a little sweet, and it's something that I figured the carbonation would cut through later, but I wanted to take a gravity reading because I realized we never really took one after adding the dates post-primary. After it sat in there and the carbonation gassed out for a little while, it was definitely at 1.0 still. So I'm guessing there's probably some residual non-fermentable sugars that resulted from cooking all of those dates. Now the community also voted for the name for this thing, and there were some interesting contenders. YouTube only lets us put up 5 options for a poll. So we put up our 5 options, and they were the ones that we liked the most from the options that folks had suggested. We had Date a Viking Banana, The Democracy, Apes-Ertief, Pantry Raid Party Ale, and Corona Frankenstein. So which name won? Well, it was a clear winner. Date a Viking Banana came in at 42%. And the person who originally recommended it had actually also recommended some potential label art in his initial post. Viewer Andrew, who suggested Date a Viking Banana, said he would put a picture of a date wearing a Viking hat, but instead of horns, they're bananas. So I only felt that it was right to hop over onto Fiverr and pay somebody $5 to draw this thing up. So I present to you, Doing the Most subscribers, your viewer's choice date banana Gruit wine thing, Date a Viking Banana. And now let's get this thing tasted. Pouring off a draw, the carbonic acid actually kind of cuts through some of that sweetness in a nice way. But the banana flavor, surprisingly, is very, very forward. And I think that's probably because dates don't have a lot of flavor on their own. Dates are little sugar nuggets. And so there's just a nice, almost like banana bread hint of banana in there that pairs well with the herbs in the Gruit. I do think that I would like to experience more juniper in it next time, and maybe I should crush the juniper berries, but I was worried that it would overpower it, so I left them whole. I think I would definitely add more or some crushed up juniper, and definitely add more sumac for that kind of lemony pop of flavor. But the Gruit is actually really nice. I like the flavor of the elderflowers in here. The mugwort gives it almost like a subtle backdrop of, I want to say, like mintiness. It's really interesting. Honestly, this turned out great. And at 10% ABV, it actually doesn't drink like a heavy beer. And it tastes kind of like a beer. Like, I'm actually really into it, and I'm a little bit inspired to explore other ways to replace hops in brews going forward, because this gives it a lot of character, a lot of nuance, and I'm really happy that y'all voted for that one, because I think it really pushed this recipe outside the box. Unfortunately, I can't really speak to anything that the Kveik yeast contributed, even though I pushed that temperature up and it fermented out in about a week. So it was a fast ferment, but flavor-wise, I'm not really pulling any Kveik nuance like I have with other brews. However, I washed the yeast, of course, so I'll try it in something else soon. Thank you all so much for watching, and thank you all so much for subscribing and hanging out with us on the YouTube community page. If you haven't subscribed yet, you should hit that subscribe button and follow us on the community page and on our Instagram, because we're always having a blast with our subscribers, kind of thinking through these things, spitballing new ideas. And I think this experiment was successful enough that we'll probably do something like this again in the future. And I want to know your thoughts in the comments. How would you have executed this experiment differently? Would you have used different herbs? Would you use different ratio of dates to bananas? I'm curious what your process and recipe would look like. Again, I can't thank you enough for watching, and we'll see you next time.